smiles from the shinobi all along the arena and looks of outrage on the demon-hating populace. Okage-sama, you can't be serious. You are being bewitched by the demon. Whatever the foolish man was about to say further was cut off by a kunai piercing his throat. Behind the man was Kushina, her hair waving about with a mother's anger as she pulled the kunai from his throat and Sunshine back to her seat as the Anbu removed the corpse from the aisle. No one else had any protests that they were willing to lose their lives for. And those who were not sure about Naruto being the Kyuubi looked down in shame. Now since Naruto is not, a sudden vortex of black feathers shot up from the ground high into the sky overhead, gathering the attention of everyone in the arena. The feathers were rotating so fast around the vortex that no one could see what was going on within the eye of the tornado, but those who had known the person knew just who was behind the wall of feathers. After a full minute of roaring in the center of the stadium, the vortex died down, showing a teen who was dressed in black shinobi pants and an open vest with a chain mesh underneath. Unlike his old gray vest, this vest was a deep blue color. On the back of each shoulder there was an emblem, one for the Uzumaki and the other the Uchiha fan, separated by a black trident that went down his back. Naruto blew the traditional blank bang that hung over his eyes, and the sight shocked everyone as he opened his eyes. Because in place of his usual stoic azure eyes were two blazing red eyes with 3 tomo in each eye, the Sharingan. Sasuke's whole body started to tremble with anger as he looked into the eyes of his clan. How do you possess the Sharingan, Naruto? You are not an Uchiha. Answer my question, you bastard. Naruto raised an eyebrow behind his hanging bang as he looked into the 2 Tomo copy eyes of Sasuke, with the same bored look as always, but with the red eyes and spinning, Tomo added a hint of memorization. I awakened my eyes just like any Uchiha would. It is that simple. Naruto responded coolly, which only served to make Sasuke seethe with anger. Page Booth, your boy has the Sharingan Hokage. How is that possible? You do not possess any Uchiha blood in your family. The elderly Tsuchikage asked, staring down at Naruto with wide eyes, never expecting to find the cursed eyes on the teen in front of him. It seemed the shinobi world still had surprises for the man who had met Madara Uchiha. Apparently he does. Was all that the yellow flash could manage to choke out as he slumped back into his chair, still in shock that his son possessed the prized eyes of the Uchiha clan. Yet here was his son wielding sad eyes against the teen who was supposed to be the last Uchiha. Mei was simply staring down in silence with the rest of the stadium at the teen that caught her eye the day before when she finally registered what the fire shadow had said. Wait, apparently. Do you mean to tell me that you didn't know that Naruto had the Sharingan? Mei asked disbelievingly of a sentiment shared by the other Kage as well. Naruto is a very secretive individual. He says only what is necessary and lets out things only when he is ready. And if I try to force anything out of him, he will clamp up. Minato admitted with a frown as he looked down at his son, who had always been an enigma since his return. No matter what effort he or his family had made, Naruto had put up a wall to keep them a certain distance away from him. There is something going on in their family. From the way Naruto glared at him yesterday to the lack of communication between him and Naruto. Interesting, and if I play my cards right, I might be able to hurt Konoha and get a new ally. Not to mention Naruto is quite handsome. Mei thought, licking her lips at the last thought. You can't command around your own son. What a disgrace. A said through his loud laughter, taking a shot at his speed rival, ignoring the narrowed glare he got from the 4th leaf shadow to focus in on laughing at his incompetence. Oh yes, and from what I hear you can only order your brother around when he is within arm's reach of you. Minato shot back, taking pleasure in the annoyed look and the instinctive hand clench from the hulking Raikage. After the barbs were finished, the booth fell into a silence, waiting to see the match between the two Uchiha. In the stands, Kakashi's own Sharingan left wife behind his headband as he looked down at his sensei's son, who was displaying 2 of his own. Kikushina-sama, who does Naruto have the Sharingan? I didn't know there was Uchiha blood in him. We don't, or at least we didn't. Naruto never showed any sign of it before when he was still around the family. When did he get those eyes? Kushina, just like her husband and the rest of the crowd, was left speechless at Naruto's new appearance. There was no denying what was right in front of their eyes. Asuma, getting over his shock, chuckled as he went to replace the cigarette that fell from his mouth when Naruto appeared. Man, that kid just keeps getting more and more interesting. Asuma had always seen Naruto in his childhood because he would often stay at the Sarutobi compound. At first Asuma had felt envious of the young Naruto for having his father's attention, but that soon went away when he saw how bad Naruto had it. And since he had come back, the two often played shogi and talked with each other. Asuma had even given Naruto some advice on wind manipulation. Combat field. Sasuke glared at Naruto, the 2 tomo in each of his eyes spinning around violently as his eyes responded to the rage he was feeling at facing down someone who disgraced his name. You dare to show me those eyes? You're no Uchiha. I could handle Kakashi having 1 eye, but you have 2. Sasuke shot forward and his speed improved from last month as he threw a quick punch straight to Naruto's face, not allowing Naruto to respond to his heated words. Naruto showed no sign of worry as he swayed to the left, avoiding the attack easily. Sasuke growled and threw another combination of body blows that Naruto was easily able to avoid thanks to the Sharingan. Scowling, Sasuke lunged at Naruto with a side kick that Naruto harmlessly brushed aside with the back of his hand. Sasuke was not done yet because he had spun with the momentum. Naruto redirected with a fist bearing down towards Naruto's face. Naruto glanced at the attack and ducked under the blow, lashing out with a kick that nailed Sasuke in the gut and sent him skidding backwards, heaving from the force behind the attack. Naruto stood there waiting patiently for Sasuke to attack again, not drawing twilight yet. Sasuke tried his best to glare a hole through Naruto's head, but Naruto was not bothered by his hateful gaze because he had become accustomed to such things. Sasuke kicked up his speed and appeared behind Naruto, taking use of Lee's shadow of the dancing leaf to kick Naruto high into the air, where he kicked up to hover over Naruto who was coming quickly. Performing a sudden flip in the air, Sasuke smashed his heel down on the back of Naruto's head, throwing him back to the ground. Just when Sasuke was about to celebrate his quick win, the Naruto he struck went up in a cloud of smoke, telling Sasuke it was one of Naruto's shadow clones. Looking around, Sasuke found nothing until he glanced up to find Naruto dropping an elbow on top of him. The Avenger managed to bring his guard up and lessen the effect of the blow. Naruto landed softly on his feet, brushing the dirt off his arms before regarding Sasuke with his Sharingan gleaming brilliantly in the sunlight. Naruto shook his head when he watched Sasuke drop into the Interceptor Fist Jutsu style. Your combat style is reliant on your Sharingan, yet you are facing someone with a high knowledge of said style and more experience wielding the Sharingan than you. This is not a fight you can win. Naruto informed Sasuke with an even-keeled tone, not even holding arrogance, just truth. Sasuke growled at the Uchiha and the son of the Hokage for his slay at the difference between their skill levels. Let's see how you like the taste of Uchiha's most useful food, Sasuke shouted while going through the signs for the Uchiha's favorite fire. Sasuke leaned back as a burning sensation started to swell up inside of his chest. Fire release. Grand Fireball. Sasuke spewed a giant ball of flames larger than anything he had done before. Naruto watched a sphere of fire close in on him and performed a substitution with the always present log. Sasuke sneered when he saw a pile of ash that was not Naruto with the man he wished to burn standing there with the same uninterested look in his eyes. Naruto stared at Sasuke with a normal intensive stare as he unfolded his arms from in front of his chest. Is that all of the firepower that you have? Naruto asked blankly as he looked at the snarling Uchiha across from him. Sasuke went through the same hand signs, except at the end of this series, there was an extra hand sign that was not there before. Naruto arched an eyebrow, wondering just what Sasuke had learned from his time under Kakashi's metaphorical wing. Here, let me show you. Fire release. Dragon Flame Bomb. Naruto watched on in slight intrigue as the flames from Sasuke's mouth morphed into a dragon before swirling up into an elliptical blast of fire that raced out at the son of the Hokage. Naruto freed twilight from the bindings on his back and channeled chakra into the blade, making the white section glow a pure white and the black gleam menacingly. Naruto closed his eyes as he came closer to him and buried his sword deep into the ground in front of him, mouthing something quietly so that no one could hear what he had spoken. Kami no Kanyamai. Exile to hell. Sasuke watched as a sudden column of fire roared to life coming from Naruto's blade, absorbing his technique into the fire. The column was not done yet, however, as it shot up and started to spread. The stadium watched on silently as the one column of fire turned into a cage that trapped Sasuke and Naruto inside. Sasuke quickly tried to escape, remembering his time fighting Haku and how poorly that turned out, but the moment he tried to breach the cage, a column of fire roared to life in front of him, forcing him to step back. In the stands, whoa, I have never seen anything like that. Ino whispered out in admiration, momentarily forgetting her obsessive crush for the Uchiha brooder. Watching as the fire erupted at random times in a perfect circle, stopping every attempt Sasuke made to break free. Sakura looked on, nodding her head since there was no way anyone could deny that the technique was impressive. Of course my Sachi would be kicking some ass. Kushina was absolutely beaming with joy at seeing her son handling her best friend and rival's son with ease. Kushina pumped her fist ecstatically as she cheered for her son, getting a small smile from those around her. Kakashi had revealed his own Sharingan to try and recreate the technique, but to his confusion, he could not see how the chakra was being manipulated. "B-sensei, have you ever seen anything like what Naruto is pulling off down there?" Amoy asked his rapping sensei with the crutches he was issued lying across his lap as he watched Naruto's blade glow in the intense light created by the flames of his technique. "No, I haven't. This is something novel that other Uchiha better figure something out quick or he is going to learn how to grovel." B replied, waving his hands around eccentrically, getting tired groans from those who were sitting around him for the second day, who had quickly become tired of his little gig. "B, sometimes I wish that someone would come around and break that jaw just to save me from your tortuous rapping." The eight tails said irritably, creating a depressing rain cloud to hover over Killer Bee's head, making even more people look over at him like he was an alien species. Combat field. The Hokage-san looked at Sasuke as a wall of fire sprung to life between the two for a moment before falling, making Sasuke much more weary than before, while Naruto remained compassed. This Sasuke is on fire. Naruto said in monotone before snapping his fingers, which was followed by a fire pillar shooting up catching one of Sasuke's arms in the width of the fire. Sasuke cried out in pain and yanked his arm away from the fire and leaped away. Looking at his arm, the Avenger could see his wrappings burnt away and skin slightly burnt after only a moment in the fire. Sasuke shook his head. He refused to be humiliated by Naruto in everything he claimed to be a genius in, and with that he pulled out a ninja tool from his pouch. Naruto watched as a Fuma shuriken flew past his side, but he could see Sasuke pull with mouth, making the shuriken loop back around. Naruto then felt his arms being pulled against his body by a ninja wire that was between Sasuke's teeth. Sasuke had suppressed the wire with chakra which Naruto was easily able to pick up on thanks to his Sharingan, but let it wrap up anyways. Sasuke chuckled as he went through another set of hand signs for yet another fire which Naruto waited patiently for. Fire release. Dragon fire technique. The flames made a beeline for Naruto using the ninja wire as a conduit for travel. Sasuke watched as the fire made it halfway through the length of the wire before the wire fell limp to the ground with the fire following soon after. Sasuke stared at Naruto for some sort of hint at how the wire had just cut and fell limply to the ground. Just to let you know, Sasuke, my eyes pick up chakra just like yours do, so trying to conceal the wire with chakra was very foolish. Naruto said, managing to pull off a blank yet still insulting tone of voice that had Sasuke scowling once again at his opponent and fellow Konoha shinobi. Naruto said nothing as he vanished in a shunshin, appearing in front of Sasuke and kicking him in the gut. Naruto sent a pulse of chakra from his soul sending Sasuke into the air where Naruto had a shadow clone waiting. The Kage Bunshin gripped Sasuke by the top of his shoulders and slammed him back down into the ground, dispelling over the Avenger hampering his vision, while the real Naruto came down with the foot of his shinobi sandal, slamming into Sasuke's gut. Naruto ignored the feeling of wood under his foot in favor of searching for Sasuke, who substituted at the last moment. Naruto searched the area with his Sharingan but found nothing due to the chakra infused into the flames surrounding him. Naruto turned and went to retrieve Twilight, no longer needing to keep up his prison of flames. Just as Naruto went to reach for his katana, the sound of birds chirping echoed out in the arena. Sasuke sped through an opening with lightning-natured chakra coursing around his hand. Chidori. Sasuke shouted using the fabled assassination of Kakashi the copycat ninja. As Sasuke's lightning-encased hand went to hit Naruto in the heart, the flames surrounding the two collapsed in creating an explosion. The crowd waited with bated breath, some of the civilians hoping that Sasuke had killed the demon, while others just wanted to see the results. Kushina, Naomi and Narumi were all worried seeing how close Sasuke had gotten to Naruto before the fires collapsed in. Kakashi was busy explaining why he believed it to be the right choice to teach Sasuke that to his eternal rival. The wind blew away the smoke to reveal Sasuke with his hand thrusted forward and a look of complete shock plastered on his face. Sasuke's hand was touching Naruto's chest, but there was no lightning or an entrance wound because around Naruto the air was swirling around frantically surrounding him like a set of armor. Sasuke pulled his hand back when it started to get cut up from the sharp blades the wind was creating. I created this move in case Kakashi decided to teach you his Chidori. As a counter I created my Fujin no Yoroi. Armor of the Wind God, though I suppose if it was Kakashi using my armor wouldn't be strong enough to handle the stabbing power. I assume I do not need to explain why your attack did not work. Page Booth. That's me, the brat is using my, an enraged Ace shouted, standing on his feet glaring down at Naruto while lightning started to spark around him. Inoki looked over at the Raikage and shook his head, seeing he was still the same unruly brat as he was in his younger days. Now Raikage Dono, surely you're not saying that Naruto-san has actually seen you and managed to create a version of his own? Mei looked at the Raikage with a pleasant smile, getting the man to grumble, but eventually nodded and sat down. It would be ridiculous to think that Naruto would have met the Raikage enough to create his own armor technique. Besides, his armor seems to work differently from yours, whereas you create your lightning, Naruto seems to be pulling in the air from around him and manipulating it to shield him. The Kazekage offered his assessment, watching the winds wrap around Naruto as if he was commanding them to serve him. Then that would leave him susceptible to the Uchiha brat's fire release moves, would it not? Inoki mused, rubbing his chin as he looked down at Son of the Fire Shadow with a scrutinizing gaze. It was common knowledge that wind would only strengthen a fire's flames, so a well-placed fireball would mean game over. I'm sure Naruto knows of that obvious weakness, but the question is, did he find some way to cover that weakness? Minato surmised as he tried to rein in the pride he was feeling watching his son had created from scratch. Minato really wished that Naruto would let them train him now, the potential he had was almost limitless. Combat field. What is that? I didn't see him even use one hand sign. Sasuke thought angrily about not being able to copy Naruto's, which frustrated the Avenger. If that is a wind technique then it is vulnerable to fire. Sasuke leaned back as the burning sensation returned to fill his chest, exhaling all at once a massive ball of flames came forth directly towards Naruto. Fire release. Grand Fireball. The fireball slowly started to shrink before it faded into flickers, then into nothing just before reaching the stationary Naruto. Sasuke stared dumbfounded by what he had just seen happen to his ball of flames. Naruto sighed when he saw the confused look on Sasuke's face and on most of the crowd's faces as he wondered who surrounded him with so many morons. Fire is a living entity and any entity needs oxygen. Fire needs oxygen to burn and when you take that away fire dies. Naruto said aloud, getting a spark of realization to spread across Sasuke's face. Did you really think that I wouldn't have a counter for such an obvious weakness? Your fire is not fast enough to take advantage of the relationship between our elements. Such a foolish thought. That voice came from behind Sasuke, making his Sharingan eyes go wide as he whirled around to face a closed-eyed Naruto. Sasuke moved to question the son of the Hokage when Naruto's body began to glow. Sasuke saw that all of his chakra was being pulled to the center and compressed. Before Sasuke could retreat, Naruto exploded blasting Sasuke into a few boulders that were nearby, making the boy cry out in immense pain. The Great Clone Explosion, only accessible to those who use the Kage Bunshin. A shinobi never allows an opponent to constantly get behind him. Naruto informed Sasuke while creating another shadow clone that stood at his side, glaring at Sasuke impassively with its own Sharingan. Sasuke stood up panting while clutching his left arm that was now limp from the impact against the boulder. Sasuke tried to manage his best glare, but it proved to be ineffective since Sasuke was now standing on his last legs. I will now allow you to experience what it feels like to have the air sucked from your lungs. The burning sensation that spreads throughout your body is truly unbearable. Naruto motioned for his clone to go forward. The clone armed with a Fujin no Yoroi closed in on Sasuke and locked him in a bear hug, and Sasuke gasped as he felt the oxygen being removed from his body. Sasuke shouted for Naruto to stop, but all that came out was a mangled choke as that burning sensation flooded the Avenger's body. The clone, who also was suffering from the same oxygen deprivation, dispelled, giving Naruto the second-hand effects of being suffocated. Naruto winced momentarily, but the Kyuubi was quickly mending the damage done to his lungs. Thank you. Naruto thanked his tenant, getting a grunt from the back of his mind. Naruto glanced over at Genma telling him to call the match or else Sasuke would be more than unconscious. With just that look, Genma nodded while wondering just what Naruto would grow into as the medics came and took the revenge-obsessed Uchiha to the medical wing for treatment. Winner by knockout, Naruto Namikaze Uzumaki Uchiha. That was the last match of the second day. Tomorrow will be the conclusion of the Chunin exams. Thank you for coming. Naruto spared one last glare at Chewing Jounin for calling him a Namikaze before vanishing in a burst of black feathers, avoiding any unnecessary questioning. Chapter 9. The second round. Daimyo booth. The 5 daimyo were all chatting civilly while they waited for the second round to start, each praising their own favorites remaining in the tournament. The most vocal of the feudal lords was the Fire Daimyo, who had chosen his favorite to be Naruto after watching the boy's impressive performance against Sasuke Uchiha, who was acclaimed as a genius even among Uchiha standards, but then again very few even knew what those standards were. Oh my, everyone sure is excited today, very excited indeed. The Fire Daimyo said with a small smile hidden behind his folding fan as he looked out at his people, citizens of Hai no Kuni. The Lightning Daimyo, who had his cheek resting in his palm, looked at the crowd with an uninterested gaze before he turned to face the Fire Daimyo with a small condescending smirk. Yes, quite the difference from the death chants they were shouting from the top of their lungs yesterday. That was quite the sight. The Lightning Daimyo said haughtily, not really caring what the civilians were saying since he never trusted shinobi after the second Raikage tried to revolt against his father and bring Kaminari no Kuni under one singular rule under his reign. Ever since then he made sure to have special limiters in place to prevent such an attempt from happening under his reign as feudal lord. The Fire Daimyo snapped his fan shut and a serious look took place on his usually aloof-appearing facial features as if he was looking at the monsters that were hiding under the skin of his citizens. Yes, when I asked Minato-san if there were any repercussions lingering after the Kyuubi's attack, he assured me there were none. It appears he was mistaken. The Fire Daimyo admitted, closing his eyes and shaking his head lightly. A small smile worked its way back onto his face when he opened his eyes again. Despite what they say, I believe that young Naruto did wonderfully. This was where the Wind Daimyo inserted himself into the conversation with his thin mustache curling down as his fat face contorted down into a slight scowl at the mention of the boy who was a Jinchuriki. Why does it matter what the plebeians think of our tools? That's all a Jinchuriki is, an overglorified tool used to make the hidden village stronger and by proxy us as well. The feudal lord from Kage no Kuni expressed his opinion confidently as he looked ahead, but at what no one could tell due to the high degree at which his eyes were squinted. Well then does that mean that your village is sporadic? I mean that Garabrad is mentally unstable on his best day, so what does that say about your village? The daimyo from Mizu no Kuni asked since he was irritated that they could not find his Jinchuriki, so what could he do? He could insult the other village's human sacrifices. The fire and earth daimyo ignored the other three as they got into yet another pointless argument over things that really held no relevance to the matter at hand. The two silent feudal lords watched as the three proctors made their way back onto the combat field. Combatant booth. Naruto stood there with Susei who was not showing her Sharingan on his shoulder, his blood-red eyes taking in the sights around him with an impassive sweep of the stadium. Naruto ignored the fact that all of the competitors left in the booth were regarding him a lot more wearily than they had done during the first 2 days of the tournament. Well, almost everyone. Naruto thought with a small sigh as he watched a mop of red hair invade his peripheral vision. Naruto glanced from the corner of his eye at Naomi, who took advantage of everyone keeping their space from Naruto to start a small conversation. I can scare her by flying at her face and dragging my talons across her face for you if you want Naruto-kun. Susei offered her partner a contemplative hum from Naruto, but ultimately ended with him saying no and Susei huffing while muttering about not being able to have any fun. Naruto stood there silently waiting for his sister to speak, which is why he assumed she made her way over to him. Naomi stood there silently trying to find the courage to speak to her brother, while an uncomfortable atmosphere surrounded the two at least in Naomi's opinion. Taking a deep breath Naomi tried to start from square one, starting off the conversation with her brother. Hello Nai-san, I know you might not want to talk about it, but can I ask why you didn't tell anyone about your Sharingan? Naruto's head turned and he faced her making her squirm slightly when the cursed eyes peered right into her soul. Naruto closed his eyes and turned back to face the field, getting Naomi to release the breath she was not aware that she was holding from the moment he looked at her. Naruto looked back out at the field and Naomi was the only one who was able to see the bitterness in his eyes. This village and I are not on the best terms, and I certainly wouldn't trust the people here to keep my secret from the filth in this village. Naruto retorted harshly, getting a small nod from Naomi, since her opinion was pretty much the same after the fiasco yesterday. Susei sensing Naruto's turmoil through their soul link, nudged her head against his cheek, voicing her support with a small caw getting Naruto to crack a small thankful smile. Naruto took notice that Naomi looked like she was struggling to say what she wanted to say to him next. Naruto decided to give his younger sister a small nudge in the right direction, just so she would speak. Is there something else? Naomi? Naruto asked using her name, getting her to look up at him with surprise evident in her eyes. The surprise quickly gave way to a look of determination which was just what Naruto wanted. I saw how you were able to use the wind to create armor for yourself, and I was wondering if you could help me with my wind training. Naomi blurted a request out as quickly as she could, while she still had the confidence to do so. She glanced up at Naruto timidly to see how he reacted to her request, but to her relief and slight unease, he showed no visible reaction to what she had asked for. Naruto remained calm thanks to his training under Mihik and Itachi as he pondered over her request. While he had come to realize that it wasn't his sisters who had caused him pain intentionally, if he agreed to help her, it would put him too close to those who had been the primary causes of pain in his life, and those were the same people he truly could say he despised. No, I can't help you with your training. I am not necessarily a good teacher or even a competent one, besides I am sure Minato is more than capable of aiding you in training. Besides after what happened yesterday I don't think it would be wise for one of Konoha's princesses to associate with the demon willingly. The villagers will go ballistic. Naruto knew what had happened before he arrived thanks to Susei who told him of what happened and sadly, it was just like Naruto had expected. Hatred just does not go away and most in Konoha were so lost in the abyss of their hatred that no matter what he could do would fix not a thing. I don't care what the villagers think. They are all idiots and I don't want Toussaint to train me. To spend time with my Nai-san. Naomi argued back stubbornly since she was tired of the unfair villagers that started to show their true colors, validating that letter Naruto left all those years ago. Naruto looked at her for a few moments and shook his head since Naomi just couldn't grasp the bigger picture of things. As the daughter of the Hokage she was expected to hold a certain amount of political weight in the future and even now. Naomi, you need to listen to me. If you associate with me the idiots in the stands will believe that I have you under some sort of spell to make you a demon lover and will call for my execution to free you. I know what Minato said yesterday, but if he were to kill a majority of the people here, then the village would become unstable and then the entirety of Konoha would be in danger. Naruto told his naive sister the truth despite how cruel it sounded. That was just how the world rotated. Naomi frowned but said nothing because what could she say to that? It was not something she could come up with a counter to. At least not yet. With that both Naruto and Naomi fell into silence and waited for Akatsuchi and Yujito to kick off the first match of the second round, each having their own thoughts on the interaction they had just shared. Combat field. Akatsuchi gave the two-tails Jinchuriki his usual dopey smile, which Yujito returned with a small smile of her own, glad that she didn't have to deal with any of the people who seemed to be overflowing with arrogance. Alright, kitten, now is your chance to impress your future mate, so make sure that you win this match, then you and he can go celebrate your victory for the rest of the day. Nibi purred with excitement just thinking of the pleasure she would feel from the time Yujito and Naruto would spend together. Yujito was glad that she was focused on the seriousness of the situation, or else she'd be blushing up a storm. Now it is time to get serious. The large Iwagakure shinobi sprinted forward, his fist encased by a giant stone, striking first to avoid Yujito from using her advantage in the department of speed. Yujito quickly flipped backwards as Akatsuchi's fist smashed down where she was just standing. Yujito slid in front of Akatsuchi and delivered two fists straight to his solar plexus, but the larger nin shrugged off the blows, as if they were simple taps. Yujito frowned, seeing that her taijutsu was not enough to crack the earth armor of Akatsuchi. Akatsuchi swung his arm to the side at Yujito, and his forearm smashed right into the two Yujito brought up to protect herself. Yujito thanked her rapping sensei for building up her team's pain tolerance, because that one attack felt like getting rammed by the painful end of a sledgehammer. Yujito didn't want to feel what it felt like to be hit squarely by an attack like that. Akatsuchi whipped his fist out at Yujito, forcing her to rock back on her feet to bend out of the path of the attack. Hooking her foot around his heel, Yujito spun around so that she was facing his back in an impressive feat of flexibility. Taking a kunai, Yujito plunged the blade deeply into the back of his shoulder. As soon as the kunai was buried into the large man's back, his body started to lose shape before it fell to nothing more than a pile of mud at Yujito's feet, getting the Kumo Jinchuriki to skim the area for her opponent. Yujito whirled around half expecting to find the large man closing in with a sneak attack, yet there was none. The stadium fell silent, most searching along with Yujito, wondering just how such a large man could have hidden himself well. Those not in tune with a shinobi lifestyle thought that. Yujito was starting to lose her patience when her tenant suddenly shouted something to her. "He's below." The Nibi alerted her container, but just a moment too late because as she looked down a large stone fist was already mid-flight and directly aiming for her exposed stomach. Yujito bit down on her tongue to keep from crying out in pain as she felt the oxygen momentarily stripped from her lungs. Spitting up a small amount of blood, Yujito's slitted eyes glared at the cheerful rock shinobi. She knew he wasn't insulting her with that look, but in the heat of battle, it felt like an insult, like he wasn't taking her seriously. "You need to calm down, kitten. You're working yourself up over nothing." Yujito, hearing the calm voice of her trusted companion, allowed herself a moment to cool her head. It was times like this that Yujito was glad she had Nibi to keep her calm and avoid making potentially fatal mistakes. "My taijutsu doesn't have enough force to crack that armor, so using the cat claws would be pointless. I can't do any kind of genjutsu thanks to all the chakra I have. It is time to dip into my ninjutsu," Yujito said to herself, channeling her chakra into her throat, creating a burning feeling to intensify. Yujito used one of the two-tails' favorite fire-style techniques. High release. Mouse hairball. Yujito spat out a ball of hair that was quickly set ablaze by the blue flames that surrounded the two-tails like fur. Akatsuchi, who had just climbed out of the ground when the ball of flaming hair turned into a mouse before it split itself 10 times in mid-flight. 6 of the 10 mouse-shaped fireball projectiles pelted Akatsuchi at different angles, making the boy yelp out in shock as the fire was hot enough to burn through his earth armor. Yujito let a pleased smirk flash across her face as she broke through the large man's armor with her first. Akatsuchi dropped his earth armor since it took up a lot of chakra, and Yujito proved that she could get through it. The usual happy and almost clueless expression on the large man's face changed into an uncharacteristically serious expression. Akatsuchi buried his hands into the soil below him, and Yujito was forced to watch as the once solid ground shifted into a liquid mud-like substance that continued to grow and expand in its width. Earth release. Mud flow river. Leaping into the air, Yujito fired another mouse fireball, heating the mud up so she could have a small island to stand atop of. That served to backfire on the Kumagakure Jinchuriki as the current of the river whirled around the small island, creating a muddy whirlpool around her. Yujito thought about jumping into the air, but then she would leave herself vulnerable to an attack while being stuck in midair. Yujito watched as the mud splashed up into the air from the sheer force and velocity of its rotations and knew that falling would spell her defeat. Yujito narrowed her eyes, seeing Akatsuchi still with his hands in the dirt, which was something that she could use. Cocking her leg back, Yujito focused her chakra down to the appendage, and with a whip-like motion, her leg flew outwards towards Akatsuchi, propelling a whip of fire to lash towards Akatsuchi over the muddy river. Fire release. Extreme heat whip. The orange flames flew towards a surprised but alert Akatsuchi before changing into the blue flames, often associated with a Nibi, at least in the village hidden in clouds. Akatsuchi released his hold over the river, getting the ground to shift back to a solid surface, and in exchange a wall of solid stone rose up in front of him, with the top half of his earth golem projecting from the middle of the wall. And just like Kakashi has the ninja hound heads. The flame whip slammed into the wall, leaving a heavy black scorch mark. Yujiro leaped forward and climbed the wall like a tree, so she was standing on top of the wall peering down at Akatsuchi, who took notice of her presence moments after she got there. Yujiro dive-bombed Akatsuchi as he tried to crumble the wall, with her claws out, and pointed at him she began to spin. Spiraling claw. Yujiro claws blurred together to look like one torpedo as she flew down at Akatsuchi, who had just gotten back onto his feet. The Iowa shinobi brought his guard up, hoping to absorb some of the impact, but his eyes widened when he felt a terrible pain on his left side. Gripping the origin of his pain, he could feel his jacket torn up and saturated with his blood, and that was when he realized that she was too fast for him to handle, now that he was wounded. Akatsuchi looked behind him when footsteps alerted him to his opponent's approach, but he couldn't find it in him to move. Yujiro spread her claws so that they were on each side of his throat just on the off chance that the large earth nin had some form of fight in him. It would be best if you forfeited the match. Yujiro started seriously, slightly pushing her claws into his skin, getting light lines to open and bleed slightly to make the threat all the more realistic. Akatsuchi knew he was done and had no plans on being stubborn about it. Give. Akatsuchi choked out the blood loss starting to affect his motor functions, and as the proctor named Yujiro the winner, the large man was taken back to medics for treatment. Combatant booth, what did you guys think? Yujiro asked with a playful smirk as she entered the booth to be greeted by her two teammates almost immediately, getting a smile from the blonde Jinchuriki. Carrie was practically exploding with boisterous praise for her teammate, while Samui indicated her approval with a much cooler nod of the head. Yujiro chuckled at the quirks each member of her team seemed to possess. Yujiro glanced over to Naruto only to sigh when she saw he was not even glancing in her direction. She had really hoped to get some kind of word with the young man with the red eyes, realizing where her thoughts were going, she stopped them cold. Wait, why do I even care what Naruto-san thinks of me? Yujiro was surprised by her own thoughts, while Nibi decided to add in her own 2 cents. Why kitten? It is only natural that you want the approval of your mate. Nibi purred out, getting an angered and embarrassed blush from her container as they went to argue about how Naruto was or was not her mate. It is my turn to prove just how brightly my flames of youth can get. Soon the whole world will see just how splendid I am. Lee burst out loudly, no longer able to hold back his youthful impulses from breaking his excited surface. His eyes were ablaze with the fires of battle in the normally black orbs. Fu, who had the honor of being closest to Lee when he had his youthful eruption, could only back away uncomfortably due to Lee's intense personality. Alright. Fu stated slowly, not really sure what she was agreeing with, but thankfully it would seem that Lee didn't hear her unsure reply. Not able to stay in place any longer, Lee launched himself over the railing down onto the field below. As soon as Jinchuriki stood in position away from everyone else because most were afraid to stay too close to him. The closest person to Gaara was Naruto, who just didn't care who he was near, and neither did Gaara. Gaara watched Lee look up at him, and he let a grin flash across his face, so quickly he missed it looking right at him. Gaara disappeared inside of a sand shunshin with one thought going through his mind. Just how would your blood dye my sand? Combat field. Lee's cheerful disposition was quickly replaced by a serious and determined expression once Gaara arrived on the field across from him. The fuzzy-browed Chunin, hopeful just like everyone present, remembered the brutal efficiency Gaara displayed during the first day of the exams, which made him wearier around the youngest of the Sand Waterfall siblings. Lee though felt the unyouthful feeling of disdain for how Gaara treated his longtime crush, Sakura. Lee silently vowed to avenge Sakura's unnecessarily brutal defeat. Gaara on the other hand was showing nothing, but if one was to look into his pale blue eyes, they would find the hunger for blood in those void eyes. Lee pulled up his leg warmers, showing off the weights he had strapped around his shins, which Lee moved to get rid of right off the bat. Gaara allowed this since it would be more enjoyable that way when he took the blood forcibly from Lee's body. Dropping each weight to one side resulting in a crater, Lee disappeared from the sight of many of the genin as he began racing around the Sun Jinchuriki. Gaara stood there confidently as his sand swirled around him protectively, his absolute defense, which was the defense that had yet to be broken, even against the assassins in the village his sand held strong. Lee came to a sudden halt behind Gaara with a strong right aimed straight at the back of his skull, but was intercepted by a blast of sand that caught his hand. Flashes of what happened to Sakura's arm went through Lee's head, quickly forcing him to leap back and become an indistinguishable blur. Gaara didn't bother to try and search for Lee because he knew that his opponent had to come to him. Not a moment later Lee's leg was smashed against Gaara's sand, sending some grains over his kanji for love engraved on the side of his forehead. This time when Lee leaped back, the sand followed him like a wave that threatened to engulf him. Gaara's mother voiced its displeasure when it did not feel any kind of unnatural disturbance underneath a large amount of sand from Gaara's gourd. "Hurry Gaara, I want his blood." Came the slightly crazed voice of his mother from deep in Gaara's mind, accompanied by a much more frenzied sand that swirled around the auburn-haired Jinchuriki. Upon Gaara's silent command the sand flew at Lee, making the green spandex-wearing genin kick it up a notch in the opposite direction of the incoming sand. Gaara grinned when some of his sand looped around the ankle of his opponent, making him stumble out of his quick strides. Lee threw a powerful kick that broke his ankle free from the sand shackle, ultimately saving it from being demolished under the sand's crushing force. Lee saw the sand all crush down on where his ankle was just moments prior and breathed a small sigh of relief before racing towards Gaara with determined eyes. Lee easily avoided the blasts of sand that Gaara tossed at him to keep him away and got within the Sunagakur Genin's defensive guard. Not wanting to waste his first meaningful opportunity against his sand-wielding opponent. Tensing his arm to support his weight, Lee drove his foot with incredible force, taking Gaara off his feet and knocking him up into the air. Why is his body so dense? Lee thought about how his foot impacted Gaara and how heavy the Jinchuriki felt. However, Lee did not have any time to think on the development as he pushed off his hands up into the air under Gaara. Lee started to kick Gaara straight into the air, getting both shinobi to elevate from the driving force behind the mighty kicks. There it is again. My kicks are not doing nearly as much damage as they should. Lee growled as the strain on his muscles from the upside-down kicks was starting to become notable, but luckily for Lee, they were at the top of their flight pattern. Lee, using his incredible speed, moved behind Gaara much like he had during his first round match and wrapped up Gaara as tightly as he could, not need to hold back on the auburn-haired genin. Their bodies began to spin quickly as they plummeted back down to the ground 10 times faster than the speed they had used to get up there. Front lotus. Lee cried out as the spinning mass of bodies neared the ground. Remembering Kuritsuchi's advice from the first round, Lee waited until the very last moment before releasing his bindings. A thick cloud of dust filled the air as Gaara's body slammed into the ground. Lee stood there with a victorious smirk on his face as he waited for the dust to clear and what no doubt would be an unconscious and hopefully not dead Gaara. No matter how tough he was, being dropped on your head at that speed without a chance to brace would lead to certain defeat. Lee was brimming with pride because not only had he proven his mettle as a splendid shinobi, but he was also able to get a measure of payback for his beloved Sakura. With a moment of rest came the lack of adrenaline, making Lee drop to a knee in fatigue. When the dust cleared, Lee's jaw went limp for a moment before the fiery expression returned in full force because Gaara was indeed lying on his head, but around his head was sand that cushioned Gaara, saving him from the deadly impact of the front lotus. Gaara got back onto his feet while Lee was trying to figure out what happened since he was sure that he had Gaara pinned, stopping him from manipulating the sand. Lee got his answer when the sand that was on the ground formed to take the shape of a gourd which was now resting on Gaara's back. Lee silently cursed Gaara's versatile sand as he tried to recover from the physical toll his body experienced during the prolonged setup to the front lotus, which required him to open Kamen, gate of opening. Lee watched as Gaara commanded his sand to bind Lee, which it did without question. Taking a deep breath, Lee could feel the sand crawling around his legs and steadily getting higher and higher. Gaara's grin threatened to split his face, believing that Lee had given up and he was about to kill the fuzzy-browed genin. Kickman. Kai. Gate of healing. Release. Lee took a deep breath as he felt his energy start to return to his body, as well as how his body felt lighter. Seiman. Kai. Gate of life. Release. Lee's skin started to turn red as blood flow increased to each and every muscle in his body. An intense pulse of energy blasted the sand from his body, revealing him to everyone in the stadium. I can use the reverse lotus now, but Gaara is tough and durable. I need to power up all of the way. Lee thought as he started to unlock the next gate as everyone watched on in some form of surprise. Shimon. Kai. Gate of pain. Release. Lee could feel the enormous amount of chakra flowing through his body thanks to the open gates and grit his teeth. He still had one more to go. Toman. Kai. Gate of limit. Release. Lee fluidly switched from the powering up position to his standard strong fist jutsu style with a fierce determination within his pure white eyes. In the stands, he can open 5 of the 8 inner gates. Kakashi asked in shock, a far shift from his usual laid-back, hip attitude as Guy would call it. The fear of opening any of the gates was extremely difficult even for a talented, seasoned jounin like Kakashi, yet here a genin could manage to open 5 of them. This was a sentiment shared by all of the jounin except for Lee's teacher who had personally taught his clone the Taijutsu forbidden technique. Lee, this is your power. The Hyuga prodigy of Team 9 thought as he watched his teammate ascend to a realm of power Neji could only hope to reach one day. It was a real eye-opener for the boy obsessed with fate to see someone he deemed inferior to clearly outclass him. How can you lecture me about teaching Sasuke my Chidori when you taught the 8 inner gates to a genin? Kakashi asked indignantly since his rival had wasted no time in questioning his judgment with how he taught Sasuke. My reason for teaching Lee the 8 inner gates is personal. Much like me, Lee had no skills in Gen or ninjutsu, but he had the strongest desire to become a splendid shinobi. He reminded me so much of me that I felt obligated to help him succeed. Guy said seriously, his fists clenching slightly as he gazed down proudly at his protege. Sensei, what are these 8 inner gates you keep referring to? Shino asked curiously, turning his head so that he could face the spandex-wearing Jounin, his glasses reflecting a shimmer almost as if they were resonating his curiosity. I am glad you asked that most youthful question, Shino. The 8 gates limit the overall flow of chakra within a person's body. The idea of the chakra gates comes from the body's limits on the functions that go on within it. This makes the body much weaker, but it keeps the body from expiring or killing itself. Lee and I have undergone intense training, so we could learn how to open these gates, allowing us to surpass our own unyouthful physical limits by each gate opened. Guy explained with his usual jovial attitude, returning full force, getting Asuma to let a sweat drop form while wondering if he was bipolar. Tibble let out an impressive whistle when he heard what Guy was telling them. It was basically that each gate open made you increasingly stronger than you were originally. That gave Kiba maybe his best idea since he had coupled with Akamaru. Wait. So what happens when you open all 8 of the gates? You obtain power that surpasses even cage-level shinobi. Guy replied proudly with a beaming grin, but just as quick as it came it left. But your body will also turn to ash from frying your body. Guy admitted with a slight frown, since no one had ever survived opening the final gate. The genin that had accumulated in the stands were all filled with an awe seeing just how strong one of their own really was. It showed them just how much work they needed to put in if they were to have any chance of surviving in the shinobi world. Combat field, here I go. Lee whispered before taking off at an inhumane speed straight for Gaara, who tried to use his sand to impede and possibly prevent Lee's charge, but to no avail. Lee flashed in front of Gaara, and with a swift uppercut powered by a massive amount of chakra, Gaara was knocked high into the air. Lee proceeded to strike and bash Gaara hundreds of times while in midair from one point to the next. The amount of pure energy burning off Lee left a visible pathway in the air from where he and Gaara were traveling, and large splatter-like marks marking where Gaara and Lee paused and where Lee attacked. The inhumane attack continued on for the better half of the next moment, leaving the crowd captivated by the talents displayed by the fuzzy-browed genin. With a yell of equal parts determination and pain, Lee ended the reverse lotus forbidden jutsu with a closed hand strike and kick at the same time, sending Gaara spiraling down into the ground with a fierce bang that sounded like a gunshot. Hovering midair, the red hue of Lee's skin faded back to a much more normal skin complex, with sweat dripping down his temples, the strain of the technique evident on Lee's face. The crowd all started to speak in a hushed whisper that had all blended together into an indistinguishable noise. Not that Lee heard anything, his vision and all his senses were solely focused on the teen with kanji for love on his head, nothing else mattered. Falling to the ground was too much for Lee's battered body to handle, and he collapsed onto his chest panting heavily as he kept one eye on the side of Gaara's impact. Lee groaned. He could feel that a number of his muscles were torn at various places on his body, but he knew the consequences in using the reverse lotus. Slowly a silhouette of a short teen appeared in the cloud of dirt and rocks and walked through the veil, and to the shock of most it was Gaara, and he appeared to not have a scratch on him. Lee was left in a state of disbelief as he looked at Gaara, who was grinning maliciously at his bewildered opponent. That was when everyone saw that there was sand falling from Gaara's body, chipped at places where Gaara was struck the most, but in those places was Gaara's unblemished skin. The sand armor eventually fell to the ground around Gaara's feet, with small red specks littering the grains of sand. Lee couldn't believe his eyes. Not only had he spent himself hitting Gaara with his best and strongest attack, yet Gaara was showing no sign of discomfort. Lee felt the fumes he was already running out start to go dry. Lee growled slightly when the auburn-haired Jinchuriki's sand started to swirl around Gaara, like it wasn't happy at what Lee had just tried to do to Gaara, but Lee shrugged it off. Dropping into a very weak form of his taijutsu style, Lee bit down the groan when his torn muscles moved to accommodate what he had forced them to do. Combatant booth, why is there all that red in the sand? I don't see any open wounds on Gaara or Lee. Narumi asked while looking at the sand at the Sunagakur Genin's feet with an intensity that Naruto naturally produced. Everyone took a closer glance at what Narumi had pointed out and too wondered just what was going on. Yuna, who had a sneaking suspicion about what the red specks were, looked over to the one person she knew who could see what it was, Naruto. You can see, what is that stuff, Naruto-san? Yuna asked while looking over to the teen with the crow on his shoulder, hoping he would answer or she'd feel really awkward about trying to talk to him. Naruto's Sharingan spun lazily as he looked down at the sand, already determining what the red in Gaara's sand was. Naruto turned slowly to face Yuna with his Sharingan still spinning around, ignoring the fact everyone else was still looking at him. Yuna fought down the red that threatened to flood her cheeks when Naruto began to speak. That is not blood but trace amounts of yakai. Naruto said plainly before turning back to the field. Yakai? Choji took a moment's pause in his snacking to question the word Naruto had used, but it was clear Naruto would not be the one to answer. Fu, Yujito, Samui and Yuno all looked over to Choji and Shikamaru, who were looking at them with questioning glances. You don't know what Yakai is. Yakai is basically the chakra of a demon, usually a tailed beast is the origin. Yujito informed the clueless portion of the booth that included more than Choji and Shikamaru. It was a matter Yujito knew plenty about, having one of those so-called demons sealed inside of her stomach. Combat field. Lee watched on helplessly as the sand flew at him, but his pride would not allow him to quit the match, no matter how often the proctor seemed to ask. Lee tried to throw a wobbly punch at the sand, but the sand morphed its shape to cast itself around his forearm. Lee looked tiredly at Gaara's open hand and tried his best to glare at his opponent. The action only seemed to amuse Gaara, and with a quick clenching off his hand, Lee could feel his right forearm shatter in multiple places. Lee's mouth opened up in a silent scream, but the fuzzy-browed genin still stubbornly held on to his consciousness. Watch as the sand runs red with your blood. Gaara demanded with a quiet voice that held an undertone of bloodlust within the gravely sound. Lee closed his eyes in a resigned fashion, refusing to quit as the sand continued to slowly swarm around his body all the way up to his neck. Gaara started to close his fingers, and Lee could feel the pressure slowly starting to increase, but before Lee could be compressed under the sand, there was an explosion of sand. Once the sand returned to Gaara's person, there stood Guy with his arm outstretched and a grave look on his face. That's enough, I won't let you harm my precious student any further. Guy said with so much devotion and love that it made the emotionless Gaara actually wince as he looked at Guy with a questioning look. Questioning why he would do something like that for someone who was weak and not for himself. Another voice whispered love, but it wasn't the voice Gaara called mother, it was a much softer voice that he hadn't heard before. Gaara watched as Guy went to check on the unconscious, yet still standing Rock Lee, gripping his head to try and quell the confusing thoughts storming his head. Winner by forfeit, Gaara Sabaku. Gaara did not acknowledge anything as he went back to the booth, still holding his head and his sand whipping about violently, as if echoing the storm of emotions he was feeling. Every person moved away from the evident danger of Gaara's sand as the boy in mention looked up at each and every person, seeming them move away, only further to intensify the emotions Gaara had thought he locked away. The only two beings in the booth who weren't bothered were Naruto, who never broke from his calm demeanor, and Susei, since she knew Naruto was right there. Gaara's wide eyes that were blank to anyone else were desperate when they met Naruto's calm red Sharingan. Gaara's eyes widened momentarily as his hands dropped down to his side and his sand calmed down as well. The auburn-haired Jinchuriki couldn't describe it, but he felt a strange serene feeling sweep through him. Combat field. Harry instantly pressed on her sword-driven fury from the moment that the proctor had begun the match. Not wanting to be split in half, Naomi quickly dashed to her left as the shining steel of Carrie's sword came in a downward slash. Naomi felt the pressure of actually having her elder brother watching her match. It was this pressure that hatched the idea that if she was to showcase her ability with wind, then maybe she could convince Naruto to help her hone her wind affinity. Naomi swayed back, using her natural flexibility to bend back so Carrie's sword would harmlessly pass over the front of her face. Naomi swept up a pebble as she dragged her hand across the ground with a small smile as she evaded a follow-up slash from her fellow Redeed. Naomi kicked Carrie in the hands, making the Kumo Kanoichi grimace and back off momentarily. Flicking her wrist, the daughter of the Hokage sent the pebble she had taken zooming past Carrie's ear, confusing the girl as to why her opponent used a rock on her. Though when her amber eyes went to where Naomi was, all she could see was a plume of smoke filling the air. Her questioning ended when there was a sharp impact at her ribs, then sent her tumbling backwards. Carrie managed to stop her momentum by burying her sword in the ground. She substituted with that rock after she threw it, knowing I wouldn't think anything of a small rock. Carrie growled to herself as she pulled her sword out of the ground and placed it on its rightful place on her back. Carrie knew that focusing on Kenjutsu like her partner Amoy probably made her shinobi career difficult, but that didn't mean she didn't learn a few to help her out of tight situations like the one she found herself in against one of Konoha's princesses. Going through a series of seals, Carrie put her hands on the ground and shouted out resolutely. Lightning release. Shocking inspiration. The lightning release technique raced towards Naomi with a startling amount of speed. However, Naomi had prepared herself from the moment Carrie began her signs. With a chakra-enhanced jump, Naomi flew upwards with her hands merged together in front of her face, hiding the grin that she was sporting. Wind release. Changing currents. The wind started to flow in one direction, which had Carrie believing a strike was going to come from there, but when it seemed like the perfect chance, the wind shifted direction at a much faster speed. This continued much to Carrie's agitation and paranoia until Naomi put one palm over the back of her other hand. Wind release. Playground of the Twister. Naomi shouted with a small smirk because she didn't think that she would ever have enough time to perform this, but it would seem that Carrie was more than glad to give her the time needed. The wind started to form into a circular wall of wind around the Kumagakure swordswoman, and soon the pressure got to be too much for Carrie to stand on her feet. If her mind had been clearer she would have remembered she could channel chakra to the soles of her feet. Carrie started to get tossed from one section of the twister, elevating her body with each ejection from the twister. I didn't want to show off this much already, but I needed to, so that maybe my ability could convince Nai-san to help me further my training, so that I can use this move without needing my first. Plus I'd be able to spend time with him. Naomi thought with a truly happy smile as the tornado started to dissipate. Carrie fell onto her back with a number of cuts littered across her body and her trusty sword nowhere in sight. Naomi reached into her pouch and flicked a kunai at the downed Carrie. The crowd gasped believing that Naomi was killing someone out of cold blood but sighed in relief when the kunai landed next to Carrie's head. The proctor walked over to Carrie and saw that she was unconscious and no longer in position to fight. Signaling for the medics to come and take away Carrie, the proctor rose back to his feet and sent a small nod to Naomi, telling the redhead all she needed to know. Naomi started to walk away, not really finding herself wanting the praise of the public that had fallen so low in her eyes over the span of the tournament. Meanwhile the crowd was clapping enthusiastically since one of their own defeated a foreign ninja. The most vocal of course was one very proud mother. "Page Booth, your daughter is quite powerful, Hokage Dono. It is always nice to see a strong kunoichi coming up in the world." The world's first female Kage said while smiling as she watched the young Namikaze Uzumaki walking back towards the booth that held the genin. Mei at first was intrigued with Kuretsuchi who could use Imton like she did, but she was too arrogant for her liking. Minato nodded with a small smile on his face as his father's persona took over his village leader persona for the time being. Yes she is, they both are for that matter. I was surprised however that she had time to perform that required her to use her final. That was something we did not count on. Minato admitted with a smaller smile as he started to shift back to his role as the Hokage. That Carrie girl was foolish to sit there and allow her opponent to create a defeat for her. If this was an uncontrolled environment she could have easily been killed. The Kazekage said sternly with his arms crossed tightly across his chest, ignoring the pointed look the headstrong Reikage was giving him. If the Reikage didn't like the truth then he was just as foolish as his genin, and that was the Kazekage's thought process. Inoki nodded his head with an agreeable hum as he looked on as Carrie was carried to the medics, where she would be until she woke up from her bout with unconsciousness. Watching as an enemy prepares to defeat you is definitely not a quality in Chunin, who in turn is a team leader in some cases. This only served to fuel the Reikage's glare, but even while cheering on his home, he could not dispute the words of his peers. Your shinobi is up next. Is she not Tsuchikage Dono? Mei asked an obvious question just to try and alleviate the tense atmosphere that was starting to accumulate around the 5-cage level nin. The Sandaime Tsuchikage nodded his head with a small grin, since Yuna had proved herself well thus far without even revealing too much. Showing she was using a shinobi's most powerful tool, deception. That she is. Combat field, who stared down Yuna with a rather heated look since she was aware of the blushing state the diving helmet wearing kunoichi was in every time Naruto so much as glanced at her. Fu was not sure personally why she felt such an ugly feeling when she saw how Yuna was acting, and it seemed that Jimei had no comment on her behavior. Fu looked past Yuna and saw Naruto glancing down at the field, but he seemed to not be looking at any one thing in certain. The mint-haired Jinchuriki from Taki had to win because she wanted to see Naruto kick her vile teammate Sari being all around the arena. Yuna too was lost in her own thoughts about how this tournament could play out from the matchups to the final result. Eventually her thoughts drifted towards Naruto, and just the calm presence that he seemed to create by just being present was what she was looking for in a man unlike most she had seen so far. The men in the tournament either had a massive problem with energy, arrogance, or bloodlust, but not the raven-haired teen with his Sharingan. No, there was something different, something she wanted to get to know. The thought of that brought a serene smile to the Iwagakure Kunoichi. However, both knew for any advancement to continue they had to go through the person across from them, and that's what they would do. Yuna moved forth and threw a moderately quick punch, wanting to test how Fu's reaction time was, and Fu was not one to disappoint as she moved her feet nimbly shifting back, keeping the fist from contacting her face. Yuna grinned behind the cage on the front of helmet and threw a quicker corkscrew-like punch that hit with a solid thud. However, that solid thud was because Fu had brought her elbow up to block off the impactful smash of Yuna's fist. Fu, seeing the grinning face of Yuna, couldn't help but grin as well, since not many of the genin or chunin could keep up with her, but here was another kunoichi, which only made the experience that much more enjoyable for the Nanabi Jinchuriki. Fu drove her knee up, but it was stopped when her opponent from Iwagakure blocked the advance with both of her hands. Using her newfound free hands, Fu threw out a hook to Yuna's throat, not wanting to smash her hand or knuckles against that helmet that Yuna was wearing. Yuna brought a hand up swiftly to catch the incoming fist, which got a smirk from the orange-eyed girl because her other fist was closing in on the opposite side. The smirk quickly changed faces when Yuna also easily blocked the second attack. Fu growled when Yuna refused to release her fists and did something she shouldn't have. Fu, without thinking about it, smashed her forehead against a part of the helmet just above the cage, getting dizzied looks in both girls' eyes. Fu because she had directly attacked the helmet, and Yuna because her head rattled in the helmet and the loud sound of Fu's head assaulting the helmet rang in closed space. Demei wasn't sure if he was supposed to laugh at Fu's dismissal of the obvious or shake his head at the stupidity, so in the end he settled with one huge sweat drop on the back of his beetle-like head. Both girls got their bearings back at approximately the same time and stared at each other with much more serious-looking faces than before. Okay, that wasn't one of my brightest moments during a fight. Fu muttered to herself with a small shake of her head, trying to chase away the slight ring filling her ears. Yuna brought her hands to the sides of her helmet and sighed when she felt that the tubes were still lodged into the docking ports on the helmet. Yuna brought her hands down and pushed off her back foot towards Fu, taking the mint-haired team by surprise. And in that shocked state, Fu was unable to counter as Yuna buried her foot straight to where Chimay was sealed, getting Fu to gasp painfully. Growling with a slight scowl, Fu took hold of Yuna's ankle and spun her around twice, getting the Iwagakure genin to yelp out in surprise as her world spun around and around. The spin cycle Fu was creating brought back up the vertigo from the helmet rattling, rendering Yuna incapable of sticking the landing, thus making her tumble across the field. Fu quickly caught up to her opponent and before she could recover, delivered a harsh straight right of her own into Yuna's stomach, making her grimace and roll away as a second punch fell to the ground where she was prone. Yuna got back to her feet and massaged the area struck with a small frown, but there was competitive fire in her dark gray eyes. She would give it to her mint-haired opponent, she was agile and could hit with a nice amount of pop behind her strikes. But so were Yuna's attacks, and Fu could attest to that from how her gut felt from the few blows that Yuna had given her during their exchange. Both fighters came to the same conclusion that a taijutsu fight would only be a waste of energy with no winner being certain. Yuna grinned at her opponent, dusting off her clothing with an air of confidence surrounding her that made Fu bristle, but she didn't act on the feeling, she simply waited. Yuna, looking back at her opponent, rolled her shoulders and smirked. "Why don't we kick it up a notch, because I am really tired of going nowhere and fast." Yuna offered to get a small nod from Fu, who was feeling just the same but had yet to vocalize it. More excitable members of the audience moved towards the edge of their seats to see what the talented Kunoichi would show them. Combatant booth, those two sure know what they are doing with their fists. Shikamaru said, watching the impressive hand-to-hand combat between the two Kunoichi. While normally the Nara heir would use the time to catch some shut-eye, he figured it would be best to keep tabs on potential fighters, though there was something else. Why yes, they are quite formidable in their own rights. Chijuro agreed, returning to his more shy side that he frequented when he was off the battlefield. One would think that being one of the legendary 7 ninja swordsmen of the mist would bring confidence or even arrogance, not a shy passive attitude. If the Kunoichi in our village trained half as hard as those two have, instead of trying to gain some boy's attention, then maybe I would admit that allowing them to be shinobi wasn't a mistake, but until that day comes. Naruto trailed off, getting a small giggle from both Haku and Yujito, and face palms from his sisters, who were just ashamed to be part of this generation's Kunoichi class in their village. Yes, fangirls are not cool. Samui added calmly with a small frown, remembering the few fangirls that were in Kumo, but not quite to the level of the hidden lease amount of fangirls and boys, thankfully. Ara, who was standing off to the side, continued to shoot glances towards Naruto, ignoring the rants of his mother in favor of looking towards the enigma of the tournament. Naruto, who was aware of Gaara's eyes, ignored them for the moment in favor of watching the fight. Combat field, water release. Violent water wave. Fu's mouth opened wide as a swirling tide of water stormed out straight for Yuna. Yuna watched as the water traveled the first few feet on the ground before springing high into the air, still based on the ground, creating a large roaring wave of water. Yuna jumped back, going through the hand signs for her counter technique in response to Fu's offensive. Water release. Water encampment wall. Yuna hollered as a cylindrical wall of water shot from the ground around Yuna, spinning to keep its shape. The wave slammed into the wall, and the two sources of water created a light mist that sprinkled over the crowd. The wave of water was split when the wall proved to be too powerful, and then the wave parted around the wall of water, leaving a Mizu Bunshin to fuel the vanished in a jet stream of purple smoke from the top of her water wall. Fu, who was too indulged in watching her lose to Yuna's, wasn't paying attention as Yuna formed directly behind the Jinchuriki. "What are we looking at?" Yuna asked with a cheeky grin, getting Fu to tense when she sensed that Yuna was directly behind her. Fu tried to turn, but when she heard what Yuna said next, she knew it was a moment too late. Water release. Gunshot. Fu cried out when the concentrated orb of water blasted her behind the shoulders and through the air directly towards one of the stadium's walls. Yuna waited to see if her opponent would crash or if she could right herself before the wall did it for her. Just when it looked like it would be the latter, something Yuna was not expecting to happen, happened. Just before Fu could crash into the wall, a pair of green wings sprouted from her back and flapped, keeping her momentum from sending her crashing into the stadium wall. Fu thanked Jimei as she turned to look at Yuna with a firm frown etched on her face. The crowd was left in awe as they watched the mint-haired Kunoichi start to hover with the aid of Jimei's wings. However, Fu knew that if the villagers knew that she held a beast like Naruto did, they too would clamor for her head, as was typical for people who feared what they couldn't understand. Yuna looked at the forest, green wings that were currently coming from the back of her opponent from Tokigaku with a scrutinizing gaze. That was when it clicked and she realized that she was actually fighting a Jinchuriki. Hansan told me of the tailed beasts and what village had which at the current time. If she has the 7-tailed beetle sealed within her, then I can't trade with her or she will outlast me. I need to finish this, but I need to get in close, which may be a problem with her flying. Yuna adopted a much more serious expression now, fully realizing just who she was dealing with. Secret Nanabi art. First hive. Upon Fu's command, which was basically the command of the grand insect, Jimei the small bug swarmed around Yuna, who was trying to beat the small forms of life from the air. Fu let a small smirk play across her face, because those small bugs were not normal chakra parasites, they were also created with a unique poison that would render her opponent immobile, making the fight come to, and smiled contently when she saw Yuna fall to the ground, but then her bugs fell dead, like a small bomb hit them. However, luckily one bug survived and returned to Fu with results. Fu girl, the bugs died because her chakra properties are greater than poisonous. They are. Jimei's urgent voice was tuned out at the last moment in favor of Yuna's voice that was suddenly behind her and way too close for comfort. Taking your concentration off of your opponent, are we? Well, that's just foolish. Fu then felt 2 fingers touch the back of her neck at its base, and then the mint-haired Jinchuriki's world went dark. Her wings dissipated as her body shut down and her mind wandered into the realm of unconsciousness. Yuna landed on the ground lightly with a small sweat adorned on her brow from what she had to use in the fight, but she managed to save enough for the next rounds. The proctor moved closer to find that Fu was indeed out, unlike when Yuna faked it moments before the final attack. Winner by knockout, Yuna. Combat field, minutes later. Narumi stood looking at her classmate with a small smile, already knowing how gentle of a soul the boy had. The blonde-haired Kunoichi knew that he was probably already having his doubts about fighting her, and the reason he got to this round was because the idiot Choji